On the morning of August 9, 1945, the 6 members of Japan's Supreme Council for the Direction of the War gathered for an emergency meeting in Tokyo as the first reports arrived that Soviet forces were pouring across the Manchurian border. While the debate remained unresolved, another catastrophe struck. Nagasaki was destroyed by the second atomic bomb. Yet even then, Japan's leaders could not reach a decision to surrender. If the atomic bomb was what ended the war, why was not even Nagasaki enough to break the deadlock in Tokyo? 3 days before that meeting, on the morning of August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. Within seconds, the center of the city became a sea of fire. Tens of thousands were killed immediately, while countless others suffered burns, were buried beneath collapsing buildings, or began suffering injuries whose full nature no one yet understood. By sunset that evening, Pandora's box of nuclear weapons had been opened. But in Tokyo, the first reports of the disaster were scattered and incomplete. Hiroshima's communications had virtually collapsed, and the Japanese government did not understand what could have caused an entire city to suddenly fall silent after a single attack. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo learned of the American announcement through the Domi news agency. He quickly recognized that the new weapon might provide a strong enough reason to push for acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration. So he went to Emperor Hirohito and urged that a way be found to end the war as soon as possible. Hirohito agreed that the situation had become extremely critical. Within Japan's leadership, however, wanting to end the war did not mean being ready to accept the terms imposed by the Allies. Army commanders did not yet fully believe the American claim and demanded confirmation of whether Hiroshima had actually been attacked with an atomic bomb or whether the claim was merely American propaganda intended to break Japanese morale. Physicist Yoshio Nishina was sent to Hiroshima to examine the scene. When he arrived on August 8th, the evidence left almost no room for doubt. The United States had built an entirely new kind of weapon, capable of destroying a large section of a city with a single bomb, while Japan's conventional air defenses could do almost nothing to stop it. While Tokyo was still trying to determine exactly what had happened, the reaction in the United States was entirely different. After nearly 4 years of war in the Pacific, most Americans saw the bomb as a source of hope that the conflict might end without an invasion of the Japanese home islands. President Harry S. Truman believed the new weapon could force Tokyo to surrender quickly and eliminate the need for Operation Downfall, the invasion that American planners expected to be extraordinarily bloody. In that view, the atomic bomb was a necessary evil, but one that might ultimately save more lives than it took. At the Los Alamos Laboratory in New Mexico, the center of the Manhattan Project, the news that Hiroshima had been destroyed was greeted with celebration. After years of secret work, the scientists and technicians there had seen the product of their efforts used in war. In a speech to the scientists and staff, J. Robert Oppenheimer said that his only regret was that the bomb had not been completed in time to use against the Germans. Not everyone at Los Alamos celebrated. Some scientists were shocked to learn that the bomb had been used directly against a city. They had previously hoped the United States would demonstrate the weapon's power in an uninhabited area, warning Japan and giving Tokyo a chance to surrender before tens of thousands of civilians were forced to pay the price. Hiroshima proved that the United States possessed a weapon with destructive power unlike anything previously seen in history. Togo and Hirohito both understood that the war had to end soon, while in Washington, many believed Tokyo could not continue resisting after seeing an entire city destroyed by a single aircraft. But Japan still had not accepted the Potsdam Declaration. The military leadership continued preparing for the defense of the home islands because, in their minds, the fact that Japan could no longer win did not mean it had to surrender under the terms imposed by the Allies. By the summer of 1945, Japan's leaders understood that the war was almost certainly unwinnable. The Navy had been defeated, shipping routes had been strangled, major cities were repeatedly being burned by firebombing raids, and American forces had reached Okinawa directly on the approaches to the home islands. But strategic defeat did not mean that Japan's military establishment was ready to surrender. Its plan was to mobilize the country's last remaining resources and make any invasion come at a terrible cost. Thousands of aircraft and suicide boats were prepared, coastal defensive positions were strengthened, and civilians were trained and equipped to support the military when Allied forces landed. The objective was no longer victory in the conventional sense. Japanese commanders hoped that if they could inflict enough casualties on the beaches and in the cities of the home islands, the United States would abandon its demand for unconditional surrender and agree to negotiations. Tokyo might then preserve the imperial system, limit the extent of the occupation, and preserve some of the military establishment's power. The United States looked to Iwo Jima and Okinawa for an idea of what awaited them on Kyushu and Honshu. Operation Downfall was expected to begin with a landing on Kyushu, followed by an advance into the plains around Tokyo if Japan continued to resist. Estimates of the casualties the operation might cause varied enormously and cannot be treated as certain figures. Experience from earlier battles, however, led American planners to believe that an invasion could be prolonged and inflict severe losses on both sides. Suicide forces, defensive systems prepared in advance, and the Japanese military's determination to fight all suggested that the campaign would not be easy. That danger became the strongest basis for the argument in favor of using the atomic bomb. As long as the Japanese military continued fighting, the Allies still faced a choice between maintaining the blockade, continuing to bomb Japanese cities, or launching an invasion whose final cost no one could predict. But Japan's leaders were not relying only on a decisive battle in the home islands. They were also clinging to a diplomatic path that many in Tokyo believed might still help the country avoid accepting all of the Allied terms. For months, Japan had hoped that the Soviet Union, which remained neutral toward Tokyo under the Neutrality Pact between the two countries, might mediate with the United States and Britain. Through Moscow, the Japanese government wanted to seek an agreement that would protect the imperial system, limit the occupation, and prevent the Allies from gaining complete control over the country's future. Japan's ambassador in Moscow, Naotake Sato, repeatedly warned that this hope was almost entirely unrealistic. The Soviet Union had made no clear commitment, while the Potsdam Declaration had already demanded that Japan accept terms of surrender determined by the Allies. Sato understood that Tokyo could not expect Moscow to rescue Japan from a war the country could no longer win, but the government at home was still unwilling to abandon this final diplomatic path. For some within the military leadership, negotiations and a decisive battle were not opposing plans. If the Japanese military could inflict enough casualties when the United States invaded, Tokyo hoped the Soviet Union would help it negotiate from a stronger position. For that reason, even after Hiroshima, many generals still believed Japan did not yet need to accept the Allied terms. The first atomic bomb had revealed an unprecedented threat, but it had not destroyed the final two pillars of Tokyo's calculations: the ability to make a battle for the home islands bloody enough, and the hope that Moscow would help Japan secure a conditional peace. On the evening of August 8, 1945, Moscow time, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov summoned Japanese Ambassador Naotake Sato to the Kremlin. For months, Sato had tried to find some indication that Moscow was willing to mediate between Japan and the Allies, even though he had repeatedly warned Tokyo that such a hope was no longer realistic. This time, Molotov brought no diplomatic proposal. He handed Sato a declaration of war and informed him that, beginning on August 9th, the Soviet Union would consider itself at war with Japan. The diplomatic path Tokyo had clung to throughout the final months of the war ended in that room. The country Japan had hoped would help it negotiate a conditional peace had now become its enemy. Only hours later, the Red Army launched a massive offensive into Manchuria from several directions. Formations of tanks, artillery, infantry, and mechanized troops crossed the border and struck directly at the positions of the Kwantung Army, once praised as one of Japan's finest military forces. By 1945, however, the Kwantung Army was no longer the force its reputation suggested. Many experienced units had been transferred to other theaters. Equipment was in short supply, and its defensive system remained incomplete, while the Red Army had just emerged from 4 years of brutal combat against Germany. Faced with an enemy possessing overwhelming advantages in firepower, mechanization, and combat experience, the Japanese defensive lines quickly came under severe pressure. What frightened Tokyo was not merely the danger of losing Manchuria. For months, Japan's leaders had viewed Soviet neutrality as their last remaining way out. If Japanese forces could inflict enough casualties when the United States invaded, Moscow might help Tokyo secure more favorable surrender terms. That calculation had now completely collapsed. The Soviet Union had not only refused to mediate, but had entered the war directly, forcing Japan to confront the possibility of attack from both the north and the south. The Red Army could continue advancing through Manchuria, Korea, and territories in the north, while the United States was still preparing to invade the home islands. In the eyes of Tokyo's leaders, the danger that Japan might be occupied by several major powers, or that the country's future might be decided before they could secure any conditions at all, was no longer a distant possibility. News of the Soviet declaration of war reached Tokyo during the early hours of August 9th. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo immediately understood what it meant. Japan no longer had any neutral great power that could help it communicate with the United States and Britain, and the strategy of prolonging the war in search of a conditional peace had just lost its most important foundation. Togo called for an emergency meeting of the Supreme Council for the direction of the war. Its members were Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, Foreign Minister Togo, Army Minister Korechika Anami, Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yonai, Chief of the Army General Staff Yoshijiro Umezu, and Chief of the Naval General Staff Soemu Toyoda. Suzuki, Togo, and Yonai increasingly believed that Japan had to find a way to end the war before the country was completely destroyed. Hiroshima had shown that the United States possessed a weapon unlike anything seen before, while the Soviet entry into the war had destroyed Japan's last diplomatic hope and made the military situation more serious than anything Tokyo had previously anticipated. On the opposing side, Anami, Umezu, and Toyoda were still not prepared to accept the Allied terms. They acknowledged that the situation had deteriorated rapidly, but they continued to believe that the military was capable of fighting a decisive battle in the home islands. If Japan surrendered without obtaining important guarantees, they believed the imperial system, the military's autonomy, and the entire national polity might be destroyed. On the morning of August 9th, the six men sat down at the conference table with two nearly irreconcilable views of the conditions Japan had to secure before the war could end. At the emergency meeting that morning, all six members of the Supreme Council understood that Japan could no longer rely on its previous calculations. The Soviet Union had abandoned neutrality, the Red Army was attacking Manchuria, and the possibility of asking Moscow to mediate with the United States and Britain had completely disappeared. What divided them, however, was not simply whether the war should end, but what conditions Japan had to obtain before agreeing to surrender. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo proposed accepting the Potsdam Declaration with only one condition, that surrender must not result in the abolition of the imperial system. He understood that Japan no longer had the time or power to continue bargaining, and that the more demands it made, the greater the chance the Allies would reject them. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki and Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yonai supported that position. On the opposing side, Army Minister Korechika Anami, Chief of the Army General Staff Yoshijiro Umezu, and Chief of the Naval General Staff Soemu Toyoda wanted 4 guarantees before surrender. The imperial system had to be preserved. Japan had to be allowed to disarm its own forces. Those accused of war crimes had to be tried by Japan itself, and Allied forces could not occupy the home islands. If those conditions were accepted, much of Japan's political and military establishment would be able to retain control after the war. But for precisely that reason, there was almost no possibility that the United States would agree to all of them. Anami and the other military leaders did not deny that the situation had become desperate. They still believed, however, that Japan had millions of soldiers, defensive positions prepared throughout the home islands, and suicide forces capable of inflicting severe casualties on the Allies. In their view, if the United States was forced to pay a high enough price during the invasion, Washington might be compelled to negotiate. Surrendering before the final defensive system had even been tested could mean that Japan would lose everything without securing any guarantee for the emperor, the military, or the national polity. While that debate continued in Tokyo, the B-29 Boxcar was flying toward Kokura, the primary target of the second atomic mission. The flight was carried out under operational orders approved before Hiroshima. It did not begin with a new decision made by the White House on the morning of August 9th. When Boxcar reached Kokura, clouds and smoke covered the target area, preventing the crew from clearly seeing the aiming point. After several approaches, the aircraft was running low on fuel, forcing it to turn toward the secondary target, Nagasaki. At 11:02 a.m., the plutonium bomb Fat Man exploded above the city's industrial valley. The blast, heat, and fire devastated the area beneath the point of detonation, killing tens of thousands of people that day and in the months that followed. When news of the attack reached Tokyo, the discussions at the highest levels were still underway. A second Japanese city had just been attacked with an atomic bomb, but the news did not cause either side to abandon its position immediately. For Togo, Suzuki, and Yonai, Nagasaki demonstrated that the United States could continue destroying Japanese cities without waiting for an invasion. Every day of delay might condemn another city to the same fate. But Anami, Umezu, and Toyota still rejected the proposal to accept the Potsdam Declaration on a single condition. They argued that without broader guarantees, laying down arms would place the entire future of the emperor, the military, and the country under Allied control. When the meeting ended, the Supreme Council was split 3-3. Suzuki, Togo, and Yonai supported accepting the Potsdam Declaration with one condition concerning the imperial system, while Anami, Umezu, and Toyota continued to insist on 4 conditions. The cabinet meeting that followed also failed to resolve the disagreement, leaving the Japanese government unable to reach a unified decision on surrender. After the Supreme Council for the direction of the war ended without agreement, the debate moved to the full cabinet. But the division remained unchanged. Those who supported accepting the Potsdam Declaration on a single condition argued that Japan no longer had time to continue delaying, while the military faction still demanded 4 guarantees before accepting surrender. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki understood that if the debate continued through normal procedures, the government would simply return to the same deadlock. He therefore proposed holding a conference in the presence of Emperor Hirohito and asking the emperor himself to choose between the 2 positions. It was an almost unprecedented step in Japanese policymaking. Decisions were normally prepared in advance by the government and military leadership, then presented to the emperor as an agreement that had already been reached. This time, no such agreement existed, and Suzuki was asking Hirohito to directly choose a side in a dispute that could determine the country's fate. The meeting was held in an underground shelter within the Imperial Palace grounds, as Tokyo remained on alert for further air raids. One by one, the participants presented their positions before the emperor. Foreign Minister Togo again proposed accepting the Potsdam Declaration with a single condition concerning the preservation of the imperial system. In his view, Japan was no longer in a position to demand more when another great power had entered the war. 2 cities had been attacked with atomic bombs, and the diplomatic path through Moscow no longer existed. On the opposing side, Anami, Umezu, and Toyota continued to insist on 4 conditions. They did not want the Japanese military disarmed by foreign forces, would not accept Allied trials of those accused of war crimes, and opposed the occupation of the home islands. In their eyes, surrender without those guarantees could mean the complete collapse of the national polity and the military establishment. When everyone had finished speaking, Suzuki acknowledged that the conference could not reach an agreement. He turned to Hirohito and asked the emperor to make the decision. In the early hours of August 10th, Hirohito spoke. He believed that continuing the war would only prolong the destruction and bring further suffering to the population. Japan no longer had any realistic way to turn the situation around, while maintaining the demand for 4 conditions might eliminate the chance to end the war altogether. Hirohito chose Togo's proposal. Japan would accept the Potsdam Declaration with one condition concerning the position of the emperor. That direct decision broke the deadlock within the leadership, but it did not change the military faction's position. Anami, Umezu, and Toyota still did not believe that accepting the Potsdam Declaration on a single condition could protect Japan's national polity or military. They were simply forced to accept that the emperor had chosen a different path. On August 10th, the Japanese government sent a message to the Allies declaring that it was prepared to accept the Potsdam Declaration, provided that surrender would not prejudice the prerogatives of the emperor as sovereign ruler. This was still not an unconditional surrender. Tokyo was continuing to seek the preservation of Hirohito's political and legal authority, which meant that whether the war would actually end now depended on how Washington answered that condition. Japan's message reached Washington on August 10, 1945. After Hiroshima, the Soviet entry into the war, and the bombing of Nagasaki, For the first time, Tokyo had officially declared that it was ready to accept the Potsdam Declaration. But the condition attached to the offer immediately opened a new debate within the United States government. If Washington accepted the condition exactly as written, Tokyo might interpret it to mean that the emperor's political and legal authority would remain unchanged after the war. That would directly contradict the Allied demand for unconditional surrender. In Washington, Secretary of War Henry Stimson had long believed that the imperial system could help the United States end the war and maintain control in Japan after the surrender. Hirohito remained a symbol with enough authority to order millions of soldiers to lay down their arms, including units stationed far from the home islands. If the emperor were removed or immediately threatened, Japanese forces might defy his order to surrender, and the process of disarmament and occupation could become far more chaotic. Secretary of State James F. Burns opposed offering an explicit guarantee. After years of war and casualties, the Truman administration could hardly announce publicly that Japan was being allowed to impose a condition on a surrender that had been declared unconditional. Burns also did not want Tokyo to believe it could preserve the existing power structure simply by continuing to resist until the United States made concessions. President Harry S. Truman ultimately approved a compromise response. In the message sent to Japan on August 11th, the United States declared that from the moment of surrender, the authority of the emperor and the Japanese government would be subject to the authority of the supreme commander for the Allied powers. Hirohito would be required to order all Japanese armed forces to surrender, while the final form of the country's government would be established by the freely expressed will of the Japanese people. Washington did not guarantee that Hirohito would continue to rule as a sovereign monarch, but it also did not declare that he would be removed or placed on trial, or that the imperial system would necessarily be abolished. The formula allowed the United States to maintain that Japan had no right to impose conditions, while leaving open the possibility of retaining Hirohito if his presence helped ensure that the armed forces obeyed orders and the occupation proceeded in an orderly way. While the response was being prepared, another issue arose. The Manhattan Project was continuing to prepare material for another atomic bomb that could be used if Japan did not surrender. Previously, the existing operational directive was understood to cover additional bombs, but after Tokyo sent its message on August 10th, Truman ordered that no further atomic bomb be used without the president's direct approval. That decision changed how the use of any subsequent atomic bombs would be controlled. The attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been carried out as part of an operational sequence approved in advance. From the moment Japan formally offered to surrender, however, any new atomic attack would require a separate political decision by the White House. The war was still not over. Conventional bombing continued. Soviet forces were advancing deeper into territories controlled by Japan, and the Allies were still preparing for the possibility that Tokyo might reject the response. On August 11th, the Burns Note was delivered to Japan. Washington had not accepted Tokyo's condition in the form the Japanese government wanted, but neither had it completely closed the door on the future of the imperial system. When the Burns Note reached Tokyo, the ambiguity in the American response immediately reopened the division that Hirohito's decision on August 10th had only temporarily ended. For Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki and Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, Washington had still left a path open to ending the war. The United States had not publicly guaranteed that Hirohito would continue to rule with all his powers intact, but neither had it declared that he would be removed from the throne or that the imperial system would be abolished. If Japan accepted surrender, the future of the imperial house at least remained open. Army Minister Kurichika Anami and the opponents of surrender saw an unacceptable threat instead. The Burns Note stated that the authority of the emperor and the Japanese government would be subject to the supreme commander for the Allied powers. As they understood it, Hirohito could be stripped of real power, removed from the throne, or put on trial after the Japanese military had laid down its weapons. The military faction therefore continued to demand a clearer American guarantee that the national polity would be preserved. Anami still believed Japan was capable of fighting. The army had not been defeated on the home islands. Defensive forces were still being deployed, and thousands of suicide aircraft had been prepared to attack any invasion fleet. In his view, accepting the Burns Note without further guarantees could mean surrendering every decision about the country's fate to the Allies, before Japan had used its last remaining capacity to resist. Suzuki and Togo understood that continued negotiation might convince Washington that Tokyo did not truly intend to surrender. While the arguments dragged on, conventional bombing continued. Soviet forces advanced deeper into territories under Japanese control, and the possibility that the United States might resume atomic attacks had not disappeared. From August 11th through August 14th, the Japanese government continued trying to resolve the disagreement but failed to reach a consensus. Those who wanted to end the war saw the Burns Note as the last chance to save the country from complete destruction. The military faction insisted that Japan must continue resisting unless the emperor's position was protected by explicit terms. On the morning of August 14th, another conference was convened in an underground shelter within the imperial palace grounds. Members of the Supreme Council, the cabinet, and senior figures from the military and government gathered once again to present their positions before Hirohito. Anami and the generals emphasized that the American response did not protect the national polity. They argued that Japan should continue demanding clarification of the emperor's status, or continue fighting if the Allies refused to provide a specific guarantee. Togo and Suzuki disagreed. In their view, there was no longer any reason to believe Washington would make further concessions. Every hour of delay increased the risk that more cities would be destroyed, that Soviet forces would seize more territory, and that Japan would lose all control over the surrender process. When all positions had been presented, the division remained unchanged. Suzuki once again asked the emperor to make the final decision. Hirohito declared that he could not endure seeing the people suffer any longer. Japan's remaining capacity to fight was not enough to change the outcome, while prolonging the war could leave the country burned to ashes. He decided to accept the Allied response and ordered the government to complete the process of surrender. This was the second time in less than a week that the emperor's direct judgment had been used to break a deadlock among Japan's leaders. The first time, Hirohito had chosen to accept the Potsdam Declaration with one condition concerning the imperial system. This time, he accepted the American response even though Washington had not guaranteed that his powers would remain intact. Politically, the final decision to surrender had been made, but that order still had to be delivered to millions of Japanese soldiers stationed across Asia and the Pacific, while some officers continued to see laying down their weapons as a betrayal of the emperor, the military, and those who had died in the war. To make sure no one could deny his decision, Hirohito agreed to speak directly to the people and the armed forces. On the evening of August 14th, the emperor's voice was recorded onto 2 sets of discs, which were to be broadcast over the radio at noon the following day. The recordings containing Hirohito's declaration were the final link between the decision made in the underground shelter and the millions of Japanese soldiers who were still carrying weapons across Asia and the Pacific. If the message was not broadcast, the opponents of surrender could still claim that the military had received no direct order from the emperor. Among the younger officers in Tokyo, some believed Hirohito was being pressured by weak advisors. They did not see preventing the surrender announcement as an act of defiance against the emperor. Instead, they convinced themselves that they were rescuing him from men who had betrayed the national polity. The officer most actively driving the conspiracy was Major Kenji Hatanaka of the Army Ministry. Together with several sympathetic officers, Hatanaka tried to persuade senior commanders to place Tokyo under military control, isolate the imperial palace, and cut off all communication with the outside world. If they could seize the recordings before the scheduled broadcast, they hoped the surrender decision could be reversed before the country learned of it. But Army Minister Korechika Anami did not give them the support they needed. Anami had opposed accepting the Allied response and still believed the military could continue fighting. But once Hirohito had made his final decision, he pledged that the army would obey the emperor's will. Anami did not organize forces to stop the younger officers from acting, but neither would he allow them to use his name and authority to legitimize a coup. Without the open backing of the army minister, Hatanaka and his fellow conspirators decided to act anyway. During the night, they entered the imperial palace grounds, seized several gates, cut communication lines, and tried to take control of the guard forces. To gain command of the unit protecting the palace, Hatanaka went to Lieutenant General Takeshi Mori, commander of the 1st Imperial Guards Division, and demanded that he join the conspiracy. Mori refused. He would not use the army against a decision already issued by the emperor. The confrontation ended with Mori's murder. The rebels then used his name to forge orders directing the imperial guards. For a brief period, the officers involved in the conspiracy appeared to have gained control of the palace. The gates were sealed, soldiers were deployed under forged orders, and officials inside did not know which forces remained loyal to the government. Hatanaka's most important objective was to find the recording discs. The rebels searched rooms, inspected places where documents might have been hidden, and interrogated palace staff. Electricity was cut in parts of the compound, making the search through the dark corridors even more chaotic. But loyal officials had concealed the recordings, and the coup leaders did not know exactly where they were being kept. For hours, they found nothing. Outside the palace, the conspiracy also failed to gain the support it needed. Key units in Tokyo refused to participate without lawful orders from the senior command. General Shizuichi Tanaka, commander of the Eastern District Army, personally confronted the rebel officers and ordered them to stand down. As dawn approached, Hatanaka understood that the coup had failed. He did not control the military forces in Tokyo, he had not captured the leaders of the government, and most importantly, he had still not found the emperor's recordings. At about the same time, Anami took his own life. He had spent his final days defending the military's demands and opposing a surrender that offered no explicit guarantee of Hirohito's position. But when the emperor decided to end the war, Anami chose obedience rather than turning opposition within the army into a civil war in the capital. His death removed the most powerful figure who might still have rallied resistance within the military. By the morning of August 15th, control of the imperial palace had been restored. The recording discs remained intact and were taken to the broadcasting station as planned. At exactly noon, people across Japan gathered around their radios. Most of them had never heard the emperor's voice. The broadcast sounded formal and unfamiliar, with so much archaic language that not everyone immediately understood what was being announced. Hirohito did not directly say that Japan had surrendered. He declared that the government had decided to accept the terms of the Allies and called upon his subjects to endure the unendurable. In his message to the people, the emperor referred to the enemy's use of a new and most cruel bomb, capable of causing incalculable destruction and threatening the very survival of the Japanese nation. 2 days later, in a message addressed to the armed forces, he emphasized that the Soviet Union's entry into the war had made the military and political situation completely unfavorable. That difference did not necessarily mean that one cause was being used to conceal the other. To the civilian population, the atomic bomb was the clearest symbol of the destruction threatening Japan's cities. To the military, Soviet entry into the war showed that the High Command's entire strategic calculation had been overturned, creating a new situation it could no longer control. The final surrender announcement reached the Japanese people after a night in which, had the recordings been found, the decision made inside the imperial palace might never have been communicated. And it appeared that Truman's plan had worked. Less than 10 days after Hiroshima was bombed, Japan agreed to end the war, and Operation Downfall, the invasion of the home islands that the Allies had been preparing, was never launched. To those who supported the decision to use the atomic bomb, this sequence of events showed that the new weapon had created pressure that the blockade, conventional bombing, and earlier military defeats had not been able to produce. Before August 1945, Japan had already endured a series of firebombing raids. Many cities had been burned, and tens of thousands of people had died in a single night. Yet the military leadership continued preparing for the battle on the home islands. The atomic bomb was different not only because of the destruction it caused, but because of the way that destruction was delivered. A single aircraft could carry one bomb and destroy most of an urban area. If the United States possessed more weapons like it, Tokyo could not know which city would be targeted next or predict how quickly the attacks might continue. Conventional raids required hundreds of aircraft and an enormous load of bombs. Atomic weapons made the destruction of cities faster, harder to prevent, and psychologically more terrifying. American physicist Carl T. Compton was one of those who defended this interpretation. He acknowledged that by the summer of 1945, Japan had been defeated militarily, but argued that defeat alone had not been enough to force the armed forces to accept surrender. Through discussions with the staff of General Douglas MacArthur and with Japanese officers after the war, Compton concluded that the High Command had remained willing to prolong resistance even after the situation had become hopeless. In his view, The possibility that the United States could continue destroying city after city with bombs dropped by a single aircraft created a fear that Tokyo could not easily adapt to or defend against. In this interpretation, Nagasaki also served a distinct purpose. The second bomb showed that Hiroshima was not necessarily an isolated event or the only such weapon the United States possessed. It forced Japan's leaders to consider the possibility that similar attacks would continue, while they had no way of knowing how many bombs Washington still had. This explanation, however, was soon challenged after the war. The 1946 United States Strategic Bombing Survey concluded that Japan might have surrendered before the invasion began, even if the atomic bombs had not been used and the Soviet Union had not entered the war. According to the report, the naval blockade, conventional bombing, and the collapse of the economy would eventually have left Tokyo unable to continue fighting. But that conclusion was itself controversial. Interviews with Japanese officials and officers showed that not all of them believed the war was nearing its end. Some argued that the military could have continued resisting for months, while the coup attempt on the night of August 14th demonstrated that part of the officer corps remained willing to use force to prevent surrender even after the emperor had made his decision. This evidence suggests that Japan did not merely have to be defeated militarily. Resistance within the leadership itself also had to be broken before the war could truly end. But the fact that the atomic bomb helped create the final pressure still does not prove that it was the only means capable of producing that result. The strongest argument against the necessity of the atomic bomb centers on another event that occurred between the two attacks: the Soviet Union's entry into the war. Historian Ward Wilson argues that by August 1945, the destruction of a city was no longer entirely new to Japan's leaders. Earlier firebombing raids had burned numerous urban areas and caused terrible casualties, yet the military continued preparing for the decisive battle on the home islands. What made August 9 different, according to this interpretation, was that Tokyo's entire political strategy suddenly collapsed. Japan had hoped to inflict heavy losses on American forces once the invasion began, then used the Soviet Union as an intermediary to secure a negotiated peace. When Moscow declared war, the country Japan had expected to act as an intermediary was now directly attacking it. Tokyo not only lost its final diplomatic route, but also faced the danger of the Red Army advancing deep into Manchuria, Korea, and the northern territories while the United States continued preparing an invasion from the south. If the war continued, Japan could be occupied by several major powers before the government obtained any conditions at all. Tsuyoshi Hasegawa therefore raises a more difficult question. If the Truman administration knew that the Soviet Union was about to enter the war, why did the United States not delay the second attack and observe Tokyo's response? In his view, Moscow's abandonment of neutrality might have created a shift significant enough to push Japan's leaders toward surrender without the destruction of Nagasaki. The mission on August 9th, however, did not begin with an entirely new political decision made after the Soviet declaration of war. The operational directive issued before Hiroshima had authorized the use of additional bombs as they became ready and weather conditions permitted. The military therefore continued carrying out an order that remained in force without a separate White House review of whether to wait for the impact of Soviet entry or continue the attacks. This does not remove Truman's responsibility. His administration had approved the use of atomic bombs and had not required every mission after Hiroshima to receive new presidential authorization. But it does show that Nagasaki was not necessarily the result of a single moment in which Truman personally weighed the Soviet offensive and then decided to use another bomb. J. Samuel Walker offers an interpretation that falls between the two sides. In his view, American planners did not regard the atomic bomb, Soviet entry into the war, the naval blockade, conventional bombing, and the planned invasion as alternatives to one another. Washington wanted to combine every available source of pressure to force Japan to surrender as quickly as possible. The United States had wanted the Soviet Union to enter the war because it would make Tokyo's position even more desperate. But American leaders did not believe the Red Army alone would cause Japan to lay down its weapons immediately. Washington therefore maintained the blockade, continued bombing, prepared Operation Downfall, and used the newly completed weapon. What happened in Tokyo shows that no single event by itself produced the decision to surrender. Hiroshima changed the way Togo and Hirohito viewed the possibility of continuing the war, while Soviet entry destroyed the diplomatic route through Moscow and placed Japan in danger of attack from several directions. Nagasaki added further pressure and showed that the United States could use atomic bombs more than once, but even then, the Supreme Council remained divided 3-3. The decision became a reality only when Hirohito personally broke the deadlock twice, and the United States offered a surrender formula that did not guarantee the emperor's powers, but still left open the possibility of preserving the imperial house. It is therefore necessary to separate two questions that are often treated as one. Did the atomic bombs contribute to Japan's surrender? The reaction of Togo, the decisions of Hirohito, and the emperor's own broadcast on August 15th show that the answer is almost certainly yes. But were the atomic bombs the only means capable of ending the war before the invasion? The historical record cannot provide the same degree of certainty. No one knows what would have happened if the United States had used only one bomb, if the Nagasaki attack had been delayed, if the Soviet Union had had more time to advance through Manchuria, or if Washington had clarified the future of the imperial system earlier. The remaining pressures might still have forced Tokyo to surrender before Operation Downfall. But the military faction might also have continued delaying while the war continued, and casualties mounted across Asia. The evidence does not allow the atomic bombs to be treated as the sole cause of Japan's surrender. But neither is it enough to prove that the war would certainly have ended at the same time if the two bombs had not been used. What can be said is that during 9 days in August 1945, several different pressures together pushed Japan's leadership to the breaking point. While the use of atomic weapons brought humanity into an age in which the world would never be the same again. At Los Alamos, those who had celebrated when they heard that Hiroshima had been destroyed gradually had to confront the larger meaning of what they had created. Their work had become one of the pressures that brought the war toward its end, while opening an age in which the capacity for destruction was no longer limited by the size of an air fleet or the number of bombs it could carry. From August 1945 onward, the atomic bomb was no longer merely a theoretical possibility studied in secret laboratories. Humanity now knew that a single bomb could devastate a city, and that such power could be used more than once. The debate over whether Hiroshima and Nagasaki were truly necessary continues because no one can recreate a history in which the two bombs were never used. But however, the decision of 1945 is judged. The arrival of atomic weapons permanently changed the way humanity understood war, power, and its own capacity to destroy itself. Years later, recalling the Trinity nuclear test in the New Mexico desert, J. Robert Oppenheimer described the reaction of those who had witnessed the first atomic bomb explode. "We knew the world would not be the same. A few people laughed. A few people cried. Most people were silent."